interest. The next presentation will be on physical activity. And our speaker is Christine Cameron, Dr. Christine Cameron, who has a PhD from the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences from Loughborough University. Christine is the president and principal researcher of the Canadian Fitness and Lifestyle Research Institute and has over 25 years of experience in population-level data collection. Hello. You know what? Before we get started, I'm going to take 1 minute. I'm going to ask everybody to stand up. Can I get everybody to stand up? All right, even you guys in the back, you guys stand up. Bob. And I get you guys to reach in the air. Come on, crack, snap, crackle, pop, right? Reach to one side. Reach to the other. Put your hands together. Bring it down and go, All right, now let's sit down. Now we're ready to hear Christine Cameron. Please welcome her to the stage.
Thank you so much, Monique. I was just going to get everyone to get up and be active anyway, so I thank you for doing that. So, good afternoon, everyone. Just before I get started, I would like to express a thank you to FNIGC for the invitation here today, but also for their hard, dedicated work in pulling this report and the surveys together over the past 20 years. Congratulations, that's an awesome job. And I'd also like to recognize the regional folks and the data collectors and the participants, because your contribution is tremendous and it's invaluable. And as we heard yesterday, your words are very insightful. So without you, we wouldn't all be here today. So thank you very much for all your hard work. So I'd also like to acknowledge the Algonquin people and also to the elders in the room as well. And just to give you a little bit of personal background on me, physical activity has been very important to both me and to my family, as it's been to many lives of many families around the nation. Whether it's been playing outside as a child, where it allowed me to instill a love of nature, but also to promote creative play, to during my youth in competitive sport, now more in recreational activities, and then even being a soccer mom, through to doing the day-to-day work that I do in the area of physical activity research. So I'm very happy to be invited here today to share my knowledge and the work that I've done on the analysis looking at the physical activity and sedentary data for the RHS. I'm just very thrilled to be here to report on that. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to flip through a lot of the presentation. I'm just going to go very quickly, but just to give you a little bit of background on the issue. Physical activity and reducing sedentary time are very important issues for public health. Physical inactivity is a modifiable risk factor for various chronic diseases, including those that are prevalent among First Nation populations, as we heard earlier today. Regular physical activity has also been shown to have a very positive impact on mental health conditions, as well as promoting healthy growth and development, increased self-esteem, and also perceived physical competence among young people. In addition, extended periods of sitting time is also associated with certain negative health behaviors and chronic disease. So I'm just going to actually skip through that. And so in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to present to you the Phase 3 RHS data related to physical activity, such as popular activities and participation in leisure time, as well as sedentary behaviors. And then I'm going to take a look at these behaviors in relation to other factors, which I'll describe in the next slide, and then also key considerations from the data. So one purpose of the analysis was to understand physical activity and sedentary behaviors using a multi-level approach. So we've heard a little bit about the frameworks used earlier in the presentations. And in fact, in our analysis, we looked at individual or interpersonal factors, sociocultural level factors, such as the role of family and one's social network, and environmental factors, such as the availability of opportunities to be active, accessibility, and location of the community. And this analysis adopted an approach which explored active and sedentary behaviors independently first, and then in conjunction with other behaviors that could influence these particular behaviors. So first, we'll look at adults. So to begin with, adults in the survey were asked about their participation in certain listed physical activities in the 3 months leading up to the survey. So just to be clear here too, they had to have participated at least once during this time period in order to be in these statistics. So here, this slide lists the 10 most frequently reported physical activities, and walking by far is the most popularly cited activity. And generally speaking, many of the activities listed echo those that are identified in other national surveys and also those in Phase 2. The difference from national studies, however, is that the RHS includes many traditional activities which have been included in the top 10 list. So among adults, participation in certain physical activities vary by gender. And this chart provides examples where a higher percentage of men participate in these activities compared to women. On the contrary, there are several activities where women's participation rates are higher than men, and they are listed in this slide. So walking, swimming, berry picking, traditional dance, and also other types of dance such as aerobic and modern. Participation in many physical activities and sports decline with increasing age, and examples are provided in this figure here. Participation in walking, though, remains popular among all age groups. For outdoor gardening and yard work, we actually see a general increase with age, up to about age 64, then just a very slight decrease. And interestingly, participation rates in some traditional physical activities such as fishing, hunting, berry picking, hiking, traditional dance, and trapping remain fairly steady between the ages of 18 and 64, and then there's a slight decline among older adults. Next, I'm going to shift to youth. So again, among youth aged 12 to 17, we see the most frequently cited activities. And the first one at the top of the list is participation in competitive team sports. And this is followed very closely by walking. The activities and sports that are listed in the chart round out the top 10 most cited activities. Similar to adults, we see a greater percentage of boys participating in many activities compared to girls, as shown in this figure. But relatively more girls, however, stated that they walked, bowled, did traditional dancing, and other types of dance compared to boys. Among youth, participation in competitive or team sports, bicycling, mountain biking, swimming, and skating was higher among 12 to 14-year-olds compared to 15, 17-year-olds, whereas the opposite relationship is true among those citing the use of weights or exercise equipment. Next, I'll move on to children. And again, we look at the 10 most frequently cited activities, which identify swimming, walking, bicycling, running, and jogging as the most reported activities. The remaining activities listed here were reported by under 1/4 of children. So a greater proportion of boys participated in competitive or team sports, fishing, hunting, golfing, whereas relatively more girls reported traditional dancing and other types of dance such as aerobics and modern dancing. Now, despite not being able to compare percents due to changes in questions over time, we do see that the popularity of the activities that are listed and the gender differences that are identified for adults, youth, and children also appear in the Phase 2 cycle as well. So as one would expect, relatively more older children, so those aged 6 to 11, participated in many of the activities as seen in this figure compared to their younger counterparts. But interestingly, we found that there were no significant differences between younger and older children for walking, berry picking, traditional dance, and other types of dance. So computed activity level takes into consideration participation in those listed activities that I mentioned. Also, with a standardized value representing their metabolic value, the number of occasions that a person participated in during that time period, and the duration of their occasions, we create a measure of physical activity. So this figure shows that there's a general decrease in inactivity and conversely increasing activity levels with decreasing age. So in essence, younger people are more active. And now we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. So 43% of adults are at least moderately active in their leisure time, and 57% would be considered of low activity. The percent inactive is higher than that seen in Phase 2, but this may be due in part to the questionnaire changing and wording. Now, also not directly comparable for percents, national data shows that just over half of the national population of those 20 years and older were at least moderately active, and about 47 were inactive. And using a similar data source, statistics show that fewer First Nations people living off reserve were inactive in leisure time compared to the non-First Nations population. So Phase 3 shows that there's a higher percentage of low activity among women, older adults, adults with lower education and lower income levels, and those currently not working for pay. These are similar findings to earlier Phase 2 data. In addition, among the general adult population, there continues to be a disparity in activity levels among certain subpopulation groups, including women and older adults. So using leisure time physical activity as an indicator, with only 27% of First Nation adults being considered highly active, it's important to develop an understanding of the importance or contributing individual, social, physical, and community level factors that are associated with being active. As such, here are some of the types of factors that we found associated with being active, including very good or excellent general and mental health, status, normal weight or overweight, none or limited health conditions, always or almost always consuming a nutritious, balanced diet, often sharing traditional food, feeling in balance, and certain factors that were associated with an individual feeling more healthy. So this was perceptions of participating in cultural and traditional activities, regular exercise and sport, feeling in balance, just as a few examples. In addition, we also found that having a very strong sense of belonging in the community, or often taking part in community cultural events, and certain community strengths, such as the availability of gatherings and the natural environment, were significantly related with being active. So moving on to youth, at least 63% are at least moderately active, whereas 37% are considered low active. We took a closer look, though, breaking down, expecting that younger children should be more active. According to the research, we see that really 25% are considered in the highest activity level. So looking at the low activity level, we see that similar to adults, a higher proportion of inactive youth appear among girls, older youth, and those whose parents have lower education levels. On the contrary, looking at factors associated with being highly active, so that top quarter, as I mentioned, we see very much the same findings that we saw among adults, with the addition that those who are very satisfied with their weight or who do not smoke are associated with being highly active. In addition, same as the adults, we see having a very strong sense of belonging in the community, strongly agreeing that cultural events are important, always or almost always participating in community cultural events, and as one would expect, participating frequently in sports teams or lessons outside of school, considering their community very safe, and certain community strengths and progress related to the natural environment and crime as examples are associated with being highly active. Next, we move on to children, and we find between two-thirds of children are considered at least moderately active, whereas 34% are considered inactive. Low activity rates are found among children whose parents have lower education level, living in lower income households, living in larger communities, and living in rural communities compared to those living in more urbanized environments. And among children, again, we find factors associated with being highly active are, again, always or almost always consuming nutritious, balanced diets, often sharing traditional foods, participating in sport teams or traditional activities frequently outside of school, strongly agreeing that cultural events are important, and always or almost always participating in these community cultural events. So the survey also allowed us to look at the time spent in sedentary behaviors, such as watching television, reading, video games, using the internet or social media, or time spent at the computer. But it's important to note that this excluded time that was spent at work or at school. So data was grouped into 3 categories: less than 2 hours, 2 to 3.9 hours, and 4 hours or higher. And from this chart, one can clearly see that there's a linear increase in sedentary time for adults and for youth, but there's less difference among children in the highest 2 time periods. So looking again in more detail, 13% of adults indicate less than 2 hours of sedentary time per day, whereas 54% spend 4 hours or more per day. Higher sedentary time is found among 18 to 24-year-olds compared to 45 to 64-year-olds, those who are single or never married, those who with a high school education or less, living in lower income households, and not working for pay, as well as living in an urban setting. So we also looked at the factors that are associated with the lowest amount of sedentary time, and these included often sharing traditional food, less feelings of being in balance, lower feelings of support, and certain factors for making a person healthy, such as participating in traditional events or certain factors on community progress. So one may think that the lower feelings of balance or the lower feelings of social support might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but it could be as a result of our groupings for time spent in sedentary behaviors, because we found that the opposite relation occurred between those who cited 2 to 3.9 hours. Turning to youth, 17% participate in less than 2 hours of sedentary time, whereas roughly half spend 4 hours or more, and that's per day. Larger percentages of higher sedentary time is found among older youth, and those living in urban environments. On the contrary, factors associated with low sedentary time among youth included often sharing traditional foods, low feelings of balance, advancing a grade in school, taking part in sport teams on a fairly regular basis, 1 to 3 times per week, and certain community strengths, such as not citing recreational facilities. Turning to children, 21% participate in less than 2 hours of sedentary time. And as the figures show, roughly equal proportions spend between 2 to just under 4 hours, and 40% spend 4 hours or more. Now, although there's no significant differences in the highest sedentary time with key demographic factors, we do see that there are differences in engaging in low sedentary time with certain factors. Again, you'll see they're very similar to the other findings for youth and adults. So they include always or almost always consuming a nutritious and balanced diet, often sharing traditional food, participating in sport teams outside of school at least 4 times a week, and strongly agreeing that traditional and cultural events are part of a child's life, and almost or almost always participating in local community cultural events. So although physical activity and sedentary behaviors can be considered independently, or an approach that synergizes interventions, programs, and initiatives for these behaviors, those targeting certain population segments might be useful. So understanding the key barriers, the enablers, and the motivators among particular groups is important, but we must also keep in mind the social, cultural, and the physical contexts and norms for different First Nations populations or communities. Walking is a very popular activity for all First Nations ages and gender groups, and therefore it's a very important activity for promotion to those who are less active, emphasizing the benefits of walking, including participating with family and friends, the ease, convenience, may be beneficial for particular populations. But also traditional activities have historically been important to Indigenous populations, and these were stressed, I think, yesterday in one of the presentations. But among First Nations adults, the attrition rate in participation in traditional activities has a slower decline than some other physical activities, such as participation in competitive sport. So this finding is supported to a certain extent by other data sources among First Nations populations living off reserve. So promoting these types of activities may be particularly beneficial. Perceptions of the importance of social support for health, social connections by participating in community cultural events, and perceptions of belongingness in the community was associated with leisure time activity. And a review by physical activity behaviors among Indigenous populations show that social support is an important factor. So incorporating aspects of the social network or the environment into the development, implementation, and support of strategies and policies to promote active behaviors could be helpful. Examples of social connections could involve elders, community members for support, encouragement to share and to exchange knowledge and to help bridge generations. Encouraging parents and families and peers to be involved in supporting participation, given their significant role, is also important. And inspiring and educating Indigenous program leaders and service providers to ensure that they reflect on important values of family and culture may also be valuable. So in order to help generate interest in physical activity programming and increasing retention, program developers and delivery providers can ensure that programs are culturally relevant. And this is a critical element in order to reinforce and support not only cultural identity, but also the connection to culture and to the environment in particular. And I believe that this was stressed yesterday in Manitoba's presentation. So promoting cultural teachings into all aspects of healthy behaviors and to overcome perceived and systemic barriers at an individual level, within the social environment, within the physical environment, and within the community may also be helpful. So ways to achieve this could also include the incorporation of a wide variety of physical activity options, including traditional activities and non-traditional activities, incorporating a variety of skill-developing opportunities, offer various levels of competition with appropriate athlete development models, and ensuring participants are engaged in the development of the program, I think, is critical, also including or involving role models. So, ensuring appropriate and accessible facilities are available in all communities, but especially to those that are remote and in rural settings must not be overlooked. Research shows that children spending time outdoors is associated with higher moderate to vigorous intensity activities and less sedentary time. So understanding the perception of both the availability of facilities, but also their satisfaction or what they attribute as important facilities, and to understand the usage of the facilities is important. So this is a consideration for First Nations people living in urban, rural, and remote settings, as it can vary depending on their community context. So I condensed a lot of data into a very short amount of time, but I did just want to provide you more with a flavor of the types of data that's available, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Hi there, thank you for your presentation. I'm a Jordan's Principal Service Coordinator in Eskizoni First Nation in Cape Breton. And I just wanted to speak to the traditional activities in terms of physical activity. Mm-hmm. Through Jordan's Principal, we have been able to get a number of traditional activities like traditional dance, drum making, bushcraft, all under physical activity. We've been able to get a lot of things like that funded, and it's wonderful to see.
That's excellent. I should also say that in the RHS, although there's the broad traditional activities, there are some, like up in the north, for example, that would have different types of activities, probably not covered into the RHS. You may be collecting it yourselves in your own modules, but it's really important not to lose those community-specific activities like the northern, northern games or northern activities.
Sadness with the physical activity data is that we only cover the past 3 months, because for us in the north, activities are very seasonal.
Right.
What you do in the spring, summer, fall, or winter is very dependent on the season.
Yes.
So I am afraid that we haven't captured the full range of physical activities that people participate in, and that I find it a huge limitation.
Agreed. There are certain limitations, and we'll make sure we include that into the report as well. That's very important to note that.
Anybody else? All questioned out? I can't believe it. Okay, well, thank you very much. Let's give her a round of applause. Awesome. Good job. All right, we are in our last presentation, and we are rounding out our presentation with some incredible presenters who are going to speak about food security. And I'd like to invite Elisa Levi Elisa is a health and food systems consultant, active in nonprofit leadership. Elisa, am I saying this right? Elisa? Oh, yes. Thank you. Okay. Sits on the boards of the Circle of Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, academic. Oh, I apologize. I'm going to destroy this. Nizabad. Anyway, please say this. And the Toronto Board of Public Health. Please welcome Elisa Levi. I'd also like to invite Kelly Skinner. Kelly Skinner is an assistant professor at the School of Public Health and Health Systems at the University of Waterloo, where she leads and teaches in the new online Masters of Health Evaluation program. Kelly's research and evaluation interests focus on the health and well-being of First Nations populations and northern communities in areas of chronic disease prevention, evaluation of health programs, youth health, and community capacity development. Please welcome Kelly and Elisa.
Thank you for that introduction. My colleague and co-author, Elisa Levi, videotaped herself, so you will get to see her presenting here. And she's going to provide some framing for this chapter on nutrition and food security. She's going to introduce the chapter and introduce herself as well in the video, and then she'll also provide the discussion section. So thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge the land we are on and all of the people who have contributed to the RHS. It's such a big undertaking, and there's so many people who have been involved in this. Where's my clicker? So this is Elisa's introduction. She's going to introduce herself and then frame the chapter on nutrition and food security for us.
Bonjour, my name is Elisa Levi. I'm an Anishinaabe, a member of the Chippewas of Nawash in Ontario, and I also consider Elsipogtog First Nation home in New Brunswick. It has been a privilege to weave together the results of the Regional Health Survey 3 in writing a chapter on nutrition and food security. In the next few minutes, I will position the setting to which Kelly will describe the methods and findings from the Regional Health Survey 3. I cannot help but think of my family, First Nations who filled out the survey coast to coast, and our ancestors as we frame a story around food. For First Nations, food is intricately tied to Mother Earth, our connection through practice and ceremony of who we are and the stories that continue to come with food. In writing this chapter, we wanted to put food at the center. Our natural food systems arise from complex and holistic food acquisition and distribution systems that provided health benefits beyond nutrition. Nutrition, as we know it, is the intake of food considered in relation to our body's needs. In understanding and the framing of the questions and results in the RHS, we recognize that the transition has occurred in the past several generations as a result of colonial systems such as the Indian Act and the Indian residential school system. These have had a significant impact on decreasing individual and community participation in local food systems. We must recognize the strengths in food systems that is closely tied to language and participatory action, and that this action sustains our bodies, and it has never been easy. In the past decade, coupled with the nutrition transition described, food insecurity has been documented as an urgent issue, both on and off reserve, and higher than the general population, resulting in health and diet-related complications such as diabetes. The RHS-2 was the first national survey to measure income-related household food insecurity in First Nations communities across the country. We found that more than half, 54% of all households were food insecure. Household food insecurity tools, such as the tool used in the Regional Health Survey, measure only the most severe elements of the food insecurity experience, seeking information on behaviors and characteristics that characterize households when they are having difficulty meeting their food needs. While important, especially in helping direct necessary programs and establish benchmarks for improvements, tools that focus on economics of food miss a cultural element. For this reason, it is important to discuss findings that include cultural elements of food sovereignty. In the RHS2, 85% of respondents indicated having traditional foods shared with them. And this year, we're able to explore participation in traditional food acquisition methods, such as hunting, trapping, and fishing, and blueberry picking. In the First Nations Regional Education, Employment, and Early Childhood Development survey, it was found that 1/3 of First Nations youth reported that elders helped them learn about traditional teachings and practices. The well-being of our future generations can be assured through a continued honoring of our foods and food systems. Thank you. I'll be back to present on the discussion.
Okay, thanks to Elisa for recording that and not being, unfortunately, wasn't able to be here. So I'm just going to go through very quickly some of the questions that were on food. This is a fairly short chapter. There's not a whole lot of questions on nutrition and only a small section on food security. So with respect to eating habits, people were asked on average how often they eat or drink certain foods, whether they had participated in harvesting activities, which you saw with the physical activity chapter that was just presented, as well as eating habits with respect to traditional foods. So in the past 12 months, how often have you eaten the following traditional foods? Acknowledging that some of those foods may not be considered traditional for all individuals or all regions. With respect to, sorry, there's also a couple of questions I didn't put on the slide. So it was also asked in the past 12 months, how often did you eat nutritious balanced meals? This question has been presented among some of the other chapters as well as traditional food sharing, which we've seen some data on today already. With respect to household food security, this is a composite variable. It has 9 statements, 6 for adults and 3 for households with children. And it describes the food situation for a household in the past 12 months. And as you saw with Elisa's introduction, this measure is not necessarily super relevant for communities because it doesn't have a cultural element to it. It is an income-based measure. It's a shortened version of the 18-item Household Food Security Survey module, which is used nationally across Canada. So an example of a question from the food security statements are, in the past 12 months, were you ever hungry but didn't eat because there wasn't enough money for food? So you can see how these questions are tied to income. So based on how many of the food insecure conditions people reported, each household is classified as food secure, moderately food insecure, or severely food insecure. So with respect to eating nutritious balanced meals by age, and I'm just going to show some highlights from the chapter here. So more than 1/3 of First Nations adults reported always or almost always eating nutritious balanced meals. Nearly half reported they sometimes did. The percentage of adults always or almost always eating nutritious balanced meals increased slightly between age groups, as you can see in this figure. Though only the difference between the 18 to 29 age group and the 60+ age group was actually significant. And although the patterns for reporting a healthy diet by age group between the RHS Phase 1 and Phase 2 were similar, more adults reported always or almost always consuming a nutritious balanced meals in Phase 3 over Phase 2. With respect of frequency of eating or drinking from food group categories, Meat and alternatives such as beef, chicken, pork, fish, seafood, deer, moose, eggs, beans, and tofu were the most commonly reported foods eaten at least once a day, followed by bread, pasta, rice, and other grains, vegetables, milk, yogurt, cheese, and fortified soy beverages, and fruit. We saw some of these numbers in the previous presentation on physical activity, but we chose these because they are related to traditional food consumption, so people who participated, First Nations adults who participated in harvesting activities in the past 3 months, such as fishing, which was at nearly a quarter of respondents, hunting or trapping at 18%, and berry picking or other food gathering at 16.8%. It's important to note, and this sort of builds on one of the comments from the physical activity chapter, that this question was changed. In RHS 3, it was asked in the past 3 months whether people participated in these activities, but in RHS 1 and 2, it was asked in the past 12 months, which we think is more representative of seasonal variation in activities. When we look at the difference between these results and RHS 1 and 2, they're not directly comparable because of the different time frame, but these numbers are actually lower than RHS 1 and 2, which makes sense because if you're reporting over the past 12 months versus the past 3 months, there's going to be a difference there. With respect to First Nations adults who often consume traditional foods in the past 12 months, large land-based animals such as moose, caribou, bear, deer, and bison were the most often reported, often consumed protein-based traditional foods, followed by freshwater fish, game birds such as goose or duck, small game such as rabbit or muskrat, and saltwater fish. In addition, more than 1/3 often ate bannock or fry bread, and about a quarter often ate berries or other wild vegetation. Wild rice and corn soup were less often eaten. The majority, so 90% of First Nations adults reported having had someone share traditional food with their household in the past 12 months prior to the survey. More than half who had traditional food shared with their household often in the past 12 months reported that they always or almost always ate nutritious, balanced meals. So there might be a relationship there. The 90% of First Nations adults in Phase 3 who had traditional food shared with their household was slightly higher than the 85.5% in Phase 2. And I don't think we weren't able to compare this to Phase 1, so we're not sure what the comparison might be there. So with respect to people often eating traditional food by location, this figure shows that about 3/4 of First Nations adults living in remote or special access communities reported often eating traditional foods compared to a lower proportion in rural or urban communities. And with respect to household food security status for First Nations adults, you've seen some of this data in previous presentations today. If we look at a comparison between Phases 2 and Phase 3, where the same questions were asked, and this is for adults, in Phase 2, 54% of First Nations adults were food insecure, and in Phase 3, 50% of First Nations adults were food insecure, which is a slight decrease, but still a pretty high number. So Elisa's going to talk a little bit about discussing some of the results that I've just presented.
Thank you, Kelly, for sharing the results. Respecting the place that food holds within a holistic worldview, this discussion focuses on interpreting the results of income-related food security, comparing results from the RHS in 2008-2010 to the findings from the RHS in 2015 and 2014, and seeking to understand these results within the context of First Nations realities. Indigenous peoples and food are often explored within a deficit-based construct. Therefore, it is important to draw upon the opportunities for reconnecting with traditional food systems as self-determining health and wellness promoting strategies. This is where positioning health and Indigenous food systems within an Indigenous food sovereignty framework, as described by Don Morrison, provides unknown potential. Indigenous food sovereignty is guided by four main principles: the recognition that food is sacred, participation in food systems, self-determination, and supportive legislation and policy. Learning from and about the land is an essential aspect for First Nations learning and often entails experiential learning, a mode of learning that is frequently associated with traditional activities that occur outside the classroom. Therefore, when people are asked what activities, asked what they eat and how they acquire it, and when, it is important to analyze these findings, not in isolation. The results in this survey do not capture a comprehensive picture of overall diet and nutrition. There are some questions, as Kelly described, that focus on aspects of food. Now that the RHS is in its third phase, we are able to see some trends over time. The majority of First Nations adults reported they sometimes, or always, or almost always, ate nutritious, balanced meals. A balanced diet consists of meals containing a variety of food groups. For example, a selection of proteins, grains, vegetables, and fruits, as interpreted by the respondent. Nearly 1 in 10 adults reported they never or hardly consume milk or milk products. The First Nations Food, Nutrition, and Environment Study, also a national study, found that low intake of milk and other dietary products among First Nations adults. Between the RHS Phase 1 and the RHS Phase 2, there has been a reduction in reported hunting and trapping and other food gathering. Data on traditional food acquisition activities in previous RHS surveys are not directly comparable to the RHS 3 because the time period for questions changed. However, it's important to note that all data are lower than previous years over the 13-year period within the RHS. Here lies an important opportunity for learning and training of these acquisition methods. It is known that following a hunt or a harvest, it is common for First Nations to share food that has been harvested. Sharing food can increase traditional food access for those who are unable to harvest themselves and may also increase food security in households and communities. For food security, as income decreases, the prevalence of reporting food insecurity increases. As mentioned, the RHS tool helps explore income-related food insecurity. For many low-income families, the unfortunate reality is that the grocery budget is flexible, whereas other bills are not so much. 1 in 10 First Nations reported struggling through the past year to meet basic living requirements for food. The cost and accessibility of certain food varies considerably across First Nation communities for which this survey featured. Despite government subsidization, the cost of purchasing market foods remains high in some northern communities because of the long distance food must be transported. Regardless, if income is an issue among adults, the costs that are associated with buying food can vary from purchasing taxis for a ride to nearby or local towns. Moreover, the cost and accessibility also creates challenges for obtaining traditional foods. Studies have found that the affordability and accessibility to fishing, hunting, and harvesting activities can limit foods acquired by these methods. More than 50% of all First Nations households were found to be food insecure, as Kelly mentioned in the results, including 13% with severe food insecurity. The comparable statistics within the First Nations Nutrition, Food and Environment Study reported that 30% of First Nations households in Ontario experienced food insecurity in 2011-2012. Regardless, these results clearly demonstrate that First Nations households have high levels of food insecurity. There is also an association between nutrition and food security. There is an association between eating balanced meals and food security in the household. The progression of being food secure to food insecurity follows a pattern that begins with food anxiety, then compromised diet quality, followed by a compromised food quality and feelings of hunger, and ultimately not eating at all. First Nations adults who live in food secure households are more likely to report eating a balanced meal, which indicates that they have not felt that they were compromising their diet quality. Income and financial security are most significant determinants of food insecurity. And this can be, more data on this can be found on the Proof website. But what's important to note for First Nations and Indigenous peoples in this study is that this, and it's important to state that this measures income-related food insecurity. And there are many elements within the survey that can be tied to culture and health as well. Thank you.
Okay, so just to sum up and reiterate a few things that Elisa said, traditional foods and the sharing of traditional foods provide a foundation for better nutrition and well-being, as well as impacting food security. And although remote geography can increase the cost and availability of healthy traditional and store-bought foods, living in these communities allows First Nations to remain connected to their land and traditional food systems. And we've heard this several times today, that connection to land is maybe something that should be further explored in future RHS iterations. Also, we know that this measure didn't incorporate cultural indicators of food security, such as levels of traditional food knowledge, access to traditional food systems, or safety of traditional food. And as well, the role of self-determination in health and food sovereignty is an important consideration and should be included in future studies. So although the numbers maybe have gone down slightly between RHS Phase 2 and Phase 3 with respect to the prevalence of food insecurity, really this is still a significant problem and deserves action. Thank you. And I'll thank Elisa for putting those videos together. That was helpful for me.
All right, do we have any questions from the audience regarding the presentation? I think everybody's a little bit tired. They might be thinking about it. I know you guys are going to be on a flight home and you're going to be like, oh, I should have asked that question. Oh, no, here we go.
I'm just curious about, excuse me, the definition of balanced, nutritious meals in the household and how that was defined in the survey, because I think everybody may have a different definition of that. And the amount of, I guess, older adults eating or self-declaring to eat a more balanced, nutritious meal in comparison to the rates of kidney disease and diabetes and that type of stuff, because eating the food that we eat is can directly attribute to those types of chronic diseases. So I'm just curious about how the definition of balanced, nutritious meals were used, or if it was just one's perception of what that looks like.
Right, so there was a note attached to this question that said balanced meals contain a variety of food groups, for example, a selection of protein, grains, vegetables, and fruits, and dairy products. So it's really, I would say, based on a Canada Food Guide definition, not any kind of traditional First Nations definition of balanced meals necessarily. It's up to the interpretation of the participant who's answering that question and how they want to answer it. So there's definitely, some challenges with the way that question is asked.
Thank you. Just very quick. Is there just discussion around the high prevalence of lactose intolerance among Indigenous people, the Indigenous population, that may account for our lack of intake or reluctance of milk intake, and how we can fill the void of calcium and other nutrients that we would get from that? And, oh man, I don't want to say this, but I have to. Bannock and fry bread is not traditional Indigenous food, and it's a huge problem. It's the sugar and the carbs and everything else involved are contributing factors to some of the health, I think, issues that we're seeing. And when we see it listed in the surveys like this, I just like to I don't know if we can expand on that or something. Surely done.
Sure. And, Elisa and I acknowledge that the questions for this particular chapter were a challenge. With respect to lactose intolerance, we did mention, because we also were co-authors for Phase 2, we did have a couple sentences that talked about lactose intolerance being maybe one of the reasons why milk and dairy intake is low. But it's true, there are a lot of traditional sources of calcium and vitamin D in particular that come from things like fish bones and greens, and there's certain traditional foods that have those nutrients in them that don't require consumption of dairy products and should be definitely acknowledged. And bannock and fry bread, sorry, I didn't. I wasn't involved with the design of the questions, and I mean that should be something that maybe we consider not including in the future as some of the optional items for traditional foods.
Any other questions? I don't want to miss anybody. Okay, well, thank you very, very much. Let's give a round of applause. Well, we've come to the end of our presentations, and I know that many have not challenged the Air Canada gods and decided to perhaps get on the road early. I want to thank everybody for coming and for having me here as your MC. This has been a really incredible experience for me, a chance to be in a really different environment. I've always been a wannabe kind of academic. I rub shoulders with them. I talk a lot about this stuff. I'm really interested. But one of the things about this type of research and surveys and the work that you all do, it really empowers people like me to go out and to spread the word. That's the job. Our job is to articulate this and share this and to tell the Canadian public about these findings and to, get people, our own people. I was just at Ottawa U. I had to run away. I'm sorry. I had to go and speak at a class, and I was telling all these students, I'm like, I'm spent the day talking about stats, and you got to get your hands on this survey, and you got to get involved, and you got to read about it and find out what it means and empower yourself with this, because this is stuff that you guys are going to use when you write your papers and you write, you go after and you fight for our rights. This is the stuff. This is our ammo. This is how you build your foundation that you're going to build this house on, that we're going to, we're trying to make things better. And they're looking at me like this, and it's like I just discovered it, and they're all looking at me going, duh, they're all students. And so, I'm sorry, I'm sort of this like, I feel like I've had the wool pulled off my eyes, and hearing all of you speak and from such places of intelligence, and also the discussion and the challenges of collecting data, and the questions of how things are posed to our people and these types of things. Is it done in an Indigenous way? I think that is the biggest challenge of what we're doing here is you're using sort of Western modes of surveys to collect traditional data to try to fix things, fix the impacts of colonization. It's like this tug of war in which I feel a lot of you are stuck in the middle and you're getting pulled in all directions. And I appreciate from the bottom of my heart, I now know what OCAP is. Thank you. when I said that yesterday, I apologize. I definitely know what it is now, and and I will be, I feel empowered in the work that I do by what you do. So thank you for all the roads you've traveled, and the coffees you drank, and the rodeos you've dangled out in front of people to get them to come and answer your questions, and continuing on to the next phase. I just wish all of you safe travels and good spirits, and continue this work. And like my mother always says, there's a lot of issues out there. My mother, and some of the work she did as an activist in the 60s, she knew the world out there, this big, giant, all these problems that that we're facing Indigenous people. And she said, well, all you can do is take one slice of that pie and work really hard at it and give your best at it. And if we all take one of that piece, we're gonna get there. And so, she even tells me, like me and my sisters, one being a doctor, one being an academic, she says, in my day, we couldn't even vote. We needed to pass off the reserve. No one listened to women. Now look at, I got doctor daughters who speak Mohawk, and she says we're getting there, and it's like one step at a time. So let's keep going together. Let's all take our piece of the pie and keep fighting forward. Our children really, really deserve all of this. So thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Jonathan and Katie for contacting me and thinking of me to do this. I'm really honored that you thought I fit this crew here, and gave me a chance to hang out with a lot of really cool people. Normally I only get to rub shoulders with one or two doctors over there. Dr. Brocope Funnel, she's my buddy. and so, as we opened, we need to close it in a good way. And I would like to invite an elder of this territory, the wonderful Claudette Commanda, to come and close us in a good way. And I thank all of you once again, and good luck on your next steps. Thank you very much.